Hi, it's Nikolai here. Most people will agree that there isn't a universal model when it comes to organizational design. So this means that we need to tailor the organization to the requirements, particularly to our strategy. But how do we do this? This question is often raised when we introduce a new strategy or make adjustments to the existing one. We then need to translate the new strategy to the organization, as I have illustrated on this slide. This topic is related to the more general issue of strategy implementation or execution, which we know is a key challenge for many firms. To find out how this is typically done, I interviewed senior executives in 5 large firms belonging to different industries. This was not a big study, but it was helpful in identifying some issues that I plan to look at in more detail during 2016 and 17 with a larger group of companies and using more systematic methods. The first thing I did was to ask the participants whether they had recently made organizational changes as a result of strategic changes or a change of priorities. They all confirmed this, and each of the executives described 2 or 3 specific examples of organizational changes that had been done to align the organization with the strategy. However, the degree of change in the strategy differed, with a couple of firms describing the change as minor and one firm describing the change as more fundamental. And this firm was in the process of redefining its business model and operating model. So the way I think about this is as a continuum from small to big change in the strategy. If the strategy remains the same, but there are some minor adjustments in the goals, for example, we want to increase sales or improve quality, there is usually no need to change the structure. And strategy execution is mainly about getting commitment from leaders to the new goals and defining and monitoring KPIs to track implementation over time. On the opposite end of the continuum, we have big shifts in the strategy, which usually will require a reconfiguration of the overall organizational structure. But then in the middle, we have more incremental adjustments that are done to the organizational structure, which are implemented without changing the overall model. These kinds of incremental changes are much more common than complete reorganizations. Now, the initial step of strategy execution is often to establish a strategic initiative. This is a temporary project or action program that is intended to achieve new strategic objectives that have been defined. Typically, strategic initiatives are cross-functional or cross-organizational. In other words, involve people from different units in the organization, and there's often a central project team that coordinates the initiative. Strategic initiatives may be established to introduce a new product or service or to implement company-wide improvement programs, for example, related to cost reduction. Bob Kaplan, who developed the Balanced Scorecard, has argued that strategic initiatives are a key element in translating a new strategy into action. The executives that I spoke to seemed to agree with this. They also mentioned that it was critical to establish a dedicated team and staff it with the right people. But what about changes to the formal reporting structure? As I mentioned, the participants described several examples. When reviewing these examples afterwards, it seemed to me like there were 4 different moves that leaders typically take to adapt the formal organization to a new or adjusted strategy. The first and simplest one is to add a new unit. as indicated on this slide. So a new unit is added without altering the overall model. This was typically done when the main strategic change was the introduction of one new product, service or technology with few repercussions for the other existing units. This is simple conceptually, but it is based on a couple of important assumptions. First, it is assumed that we cannot just write something in a strategy plan and hope that it will happen. Somebody needs to be accountable and take on the responsibility for achieving the goal, and resources have to be made available. Also, note that one could have allocated the responsibility to an existing unit, but rather than enlarge the scope of existing units, one creates a new and separate unit to ensure that the units have a focused mandate. The second move is to elevate an existing unit to a higher level in the organization. So a unit is moved one or more steps higher in the organization in terms of its reporting relationship. This is usually done partly as a symbolic gesture to underline the unit's increased strategic importance to the business, given the new strategy. Then there were two slightly more complex moves. The third one is to unbundle certain activities from an existing unit. This is often done to avoid what we can call negative synergy between activities. I observed in these interviews and in previous studies that I've done that leaders at times conclude that there are bad combinations of activities. They realize that there are different requirements for success for two or more activities, which makes it difficult to combine them in the same unit. For example, the units may have been responsible for two products or services that actually rely on different skills or that are based on different and inconsistent business models. So these areas are then separated out from the existing units and the responsibility is transferred to a new unit. The fourth move that I observed was to consolidate activities across units. This is similar to the previous one, but is done with a different rationale, usually to achieve cost savings by pooling resources and reducing duplication of processes. And it is usually focused on administrative or support services, which are consolidated in common shared services units. Sometimes this move is enabled by the introduction of new technologies that makes it easier to perform such services remotely. So these were four moves that these senior executives used to redesign their organizations and align it with a strategy. We may add one that wasn't discussed in these brief interviews, but that I have documented in other studies I've done previously, and that is increasing integration between two or more units. For example, by establishing a role responsible for coordination or knowledge transfer. After I had completed the interviews, it occurred to me that what I had observed sounded similar to something I had read several years ago. And after a bit of searching in my piles, I found this article by Eisenhart and Brown in Harvard Business Review from 1999. In this article, they used the term patching to describe small but fairly frequent changes that leaders make to the organization, such as splitting and merging units and so on. It was published 15 years ago, but I think it's still relevant. I think that the term patching describes quite well what is going on, and as they explain in the article, such small and frequent changes can be quite effective in order to continuously adapt the organization to changes in the market environment. However, we should also be aware that patching may potentially result in inconsistent patchwork, so to speak. Let me go back to the second move that I described. Imagine if some of the people in the unit, called Unit B2 here, actually serve Unit A2 and do not work on the initiative or product that we are trying to promote by moving the unit. Then it might not be so smart to move the unit intact. Among other things, it will result in the internal client being placed at a lower level hierarchically than the internal supplier. So we may first need to consider where these people should be placed, whether they should be moved to Unit A2 or maybe they need to change their role. We probably should map more closely what people in this unit actually do before we alter its position on the organization chart. So what I'm trying to say is that patching is fairly easy if the parts really are independent and if each unit does only one thing, but can quickly get complicated if they are not independent, even for a small change like this one. So the question, I think, is how we recognize that a needed change has systemic consequences. If we make an error here and try to patch, when what we really need is to change the configuration rather than just a part, we risk introducing more complexity and we might reduce the consistency and coherence of the organizational structure. So this was a brief summary of some of the key points that came out of the interviews. I think that this framework might help clarify what aligning the organization with the strategy actually may entail. There are also some more analytical approaches to this that I describe in my book and in a recent article that you can find on my page on researchgate.com if you are interested. I will provide links below this video.